It's you up first.
Help.
Welcome to the Hackaday podcast. My name's Mike Szczys. I'm editor-in-chief of Hackaday.
Hey, I'm Elliot Williams. I'm managing editor of Hackaday.
This is episode 134. Today we're talking about hackers camping, metal detecting, 360-degree hearing, and pocket computing. We have a special treat today. Jenny List, who is one of our contributing editors at Hackaday and our resident person that loves to go to hacker camp, just got back from Born Hack and is going to talk about that, but a little bit later in the show. For now, let's jump into the news, and boy, this one caught my eye this week. Amazon is moving forward with their Amazon One project.
That sounds innocuous. One. What could it be about? It's got to be about something good.
They'll give you a $10 coupon if you let them scan your palm prints, both of them, and store them in their totally secure and not at all nefarious servers.
And the number of the beast is 666.
Oh, come on. They're not marking you, they're taking your markings.
Sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah, so Christina wrote an article on this one that kind of weighs the issues here. Now, you know, in a perfect world where everybody is all pushing for the same goal and everything is secure and designed precisely, this is not a big deal at all, right? It's just another way to identify yourself for making payments. The problem is, if you think about the ways that you identify yourself for payments, which is like sharing a credit card number or like using a PayPal account, like those can all be changed if you decide for one reason or another that you want to change those. But your palm prints are forever.
The question is what they're planning to do with it. And the obvious thing, of course, is really just substituting it for credit cards because, you know, putting a plastic card with a little smart chip in it up to a RFID reader is so hassleful that you would rather do it with just your hand. Oh, plus you get $10, right? Like what could go wrong?
$10, yeah.
I think the what could go wrong part is open to speculation, and Christina took it easy on them in some ways as she was writing it.
Oh yeah, this can get dark so fast for sure, and it doesn't.
I'm putting on my tinfoil hat right now. The problem with Amazon is that their history with the Ring thing, where they had signed contracts with something like 2,000 local police departments to allow them warrantless access to the video coming out of the Ring, something which otherwise would be prohibited by America's Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, is problematic at best. And you have to say something good about Amazon, and that is actually this summer they've started walking some of that back in that at least they're going to make the police department requests for the video feeds coming out of the Rings inspectable by the public. I still don't think that fixes the kind of backdoor around the Fourth Amendment issue. Now imagine that the police, for some reason, wanted everyone's fingerprints, handprints in all of America to do kind of broad brush, match your fingerprints against a database sort of thing. Again, something which is also prohibited by the Fourth Amendment. It's hard not to imagine that Amazon isn't going to sell them this data.
Right, or not law enforcement, or just share it with other partners that you didn't originally plan. Like you'd have to dig into the EULA.
Yeah, but that's not a violation of the Constitution.
Right. Okay. Well, not everyone's covered under the Constitution. You know,
I'm worried about security breaches, but I'm also worried about violating the fundamental tenets of American democracy.
Another thing interesting to me is like this comparison to other biometrics. So there's kind of like the gateway drug of biometrics has been cell phones, right? Because you can unlock them with your fingerprint or with your face now as well. And my understanding of how those work is that your fingerprint doesn't leave the device.
Right. It shouldn't need to.
Right. So this is fundamentally different because Amazon has, I think, 50 or more Whole Foods stores, I think all in the United States, where this Amazon One palm print payment is already available. Well, that means if you go and scan it at the kiosk at your local Whole Foods, it's then going to be uploaded and shared to all those stores so that any store that you go to is going to have that palm print on it. So no matter where you fall on like how nefarious this is or not, like that's something different. That's something you haven't been involved in with consumer electronic type of biometric stuff before. Although at the same time, like there's fingerprint scanning for banking apps, right? I don't know if that stays on the phone or not. So it's a new issue. It's something to think about, maybe something to look into and decide how you feel about it. We feel bad about it.
I don't feel good about it.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
That brings us to this week's What's That Sound? What I loved about last week's What's That Sound is reading through the answers. So many of the people were traumatized by the Macintosh chimes of death sound. I actually didn't play my favorite one of them, which is the car crash sound, which is when you really know that your Macintosh is failing to boot up. These were the jingly Macintosh crash sounds. I found it hilarious that the first ones of these were actually kind of happy and upbeat, and then somewhere along the way they switched to these ones that were like bling, 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 bling. Of our 15 responses, 8 of them guessed correctly, so I'm going to have to figure out a way to roll an 8-sided die. Can't do that off the top of my head. I'm going to go to one of my favorite old school random number generators, LavaRand, and see what we get out of them. Archive version. Are they still up?
LavaRand is
Are you
no
kidding
more.
me? You people, give me a random number generator. So we're going to do this week's random number in the cloud, heading over to, what was that, Mike?
Random.org.
Running the machine, we get...
The number is 8.
Congratulations, Joe. Your answer was old Macintosh startup in recovery. I know I've heard this sound from my past, driving me crazy till it's revealed, and I know for sure. Congratulations, Joe. We'll be sending you a t-shirt. You now know it's absolutely the old Mac startup crash sounds, chimes of death.
And if you missed out this week, tune in next week. Dan will be here hosting with me. We'll have a new sound for you, a chance to get that very rare Hackaday podcast t-shirt.
All right, leading off the hacks this week, I've got Raman Shaber's Raspberry Pi and ESP32S2 team up for Mutant C version 4. And this is an absolutely fantastic portable Raspberry Pi 4 now computer platform that he's built. This is exactly the sort of like dream hacker tool. It's got a touchscreen that slides up in a beautifully 3D printed frame. It uses an ESP32S2 to do all the kind of GPIO button pushing and sensing and coordination. And as its brain, it's got a Raspberry Pi 4. And so that means it's got fast Ethernet and a couple USB ports on it. But he also breaks out all the GPIOs. He breaks out, he adds a thumbstick and 2 buttons to control it. So you can kind of do the mouse thing on the side. When you slide the touchscreen out, if you're not feeling like tablet mode, underneath is a set of 56 tactile buttons set up as a keyboard. So it's got a keyboard built in. It's got IR. It's got Wi-Fi. It runs on an 18650 cell. It's got its own battery management stuff inside. It can be optionally outfitted. It's got a space on the circuit board for a humidity sensor, a barometer, a gyro, an accelerometer, whatever you want. It's really like one of the sweetest little portable, I don't know what it is. It's like sub-laptop. It's slightly bigger than a sandwich. It's like, it's just a beautiful little device. And it looks like this has gone through so many revisions now that Raman has it down to 3 different PCBs, and then you 3D print the frame for it. And it looks incredibly easy to assemble at the same time.
Yet complex. I mean, if you think about the lineage of this, I most closely associate it with the Motorola Sidekick phones that would slide out and have the keyboard underneath. Like the huge teams of engineers that would have been building that and putting it together and getting it manufactured. And then here we have one that's like a one engineer shop. And of course, it's not as sleek and as narrow and everything, but I'd say it's way more functional.
Yeah, it's a totally different league, right? I mean, this is a little computer in your pocket that does all sorts of useful things. Those were...
What? Those were computers in your pocket that did useful things.
They were like cell
the
phones.
goalposts,
Yeah,
the moving of
totally. But you're
goalposts.
saying this is less than that, and I'm saying this is strictly more. You can't go back in time and take this with you. So I'll give you that.
Well, I'm saying that the economies of scale that made that, like custom manufactured metal rails, and they had that click to it, and then you had the buttons that had the labels on them. Like, this is missing some of those things, but it makes up for them in all of the functionality.
This one has a
that it's
click
got.
to it. He's actually even included a video of him sliding the thing open. And this is so smooth and pleasantly clicky thanks to a really nice design. He's got these like wedge-shaped rails on either side that hold the screen in place. And then it's got actually 3D printed little pressure bumps that lock in when he slides it out. So it actually goes click, open and close. It's actually really cool looking. It looks like he spent a lot of time on that part of the design. Once you assemble it, you then put the bezel on the front, and that locks the screen in place so it can't ever come out again. It's really, really super sweet. This is definitely the fourth revision of this design. There's one thing, though, that I think is proved to be controversial in the comments, and I don't know if that makes sense or not. It's a really clever use of a standard USB-C connector and the multiple wires that brings along with it. He calls it the NeuroLink, and it's got power, ground, an I2C port, and a UART on it. And so basically this allows you to, using a standard USB-C cable that you've probably got kicking around somewhere, turn it into a generic serial interfacing device, right? So you can do I2C debugging or UART over this little USB-C cable. The complaint, of course, is that this isn't USB at all. There's no USB to be had. Again, this is one of those where if you were making a product with a deceptive USB-C cable, you'd have a problem. But basically, everybody who's putting one of these together for themselves knows which of the two USB-Cs is actually the USB and which one is the special multi-way serial connector. So I think that's a pretty cool choice, actually, to help you reuse, some commodity cables you've got kicking around rather than having to make your own special cable.
I really liked seeing the Ambi Alice Goes Down the Rabbit Hole of Ambisonic Microphones article that Christina Panos wrote this week. I am not totally familiar with ambisonic microphones, but it makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like a 360 degree camera, Elliot, where you're able to like take video of everything around you, except for it's for audioscapes. And the lineup of it is really simple. If you've seen like the stereo microphones that have the two elements that are mounted at 90 degrees to one another, it's like that, except for you have four elements. So each of them is mounted at 90 degrees to one another, and then the two sets are mounted like up and down 180 degrees to each other, but then rotated another 90 degrees. It's probably a bit easier to look at it than it is to listen to my description. The amazing thing is you can build one of these following this direction for about $100 if you have access to a 3D printer. And the finished product looks like you bought it from somewhere. It looks like high-end audio equipment. It performs like high-end audio equipment. And if you already have the XLR recorder that can interface with these microphones, this is the next project you should take on.
Yeah, DJ Jules has been making a few cool-looking microphone projects out of these kind of cheaper commodity Chinese large condenser capsules that you can buy these days. And this is definitely the most interesting design he's come up with so far. The reason you want an ambisonic microphone is because if you record the sound coming at you, like Mike said, in 3D, you can then later in software go and turn it into kind of any set of paired microphones that you want. And so if you want it to sound good on headphones when you play back, you can make it sound like that. Or if you want it to sound like, ORTF, which is the way they usually mic large concert halls and stuff, you can do that. And you can do this all in software simply by combining the four different recordings that come in these four different capsules in different ways. It's a really, really, really fun studio tool.
Yeah, and like you said, those capsules are not difficult to hook up. He has a circuit that is based on the simple P48. It only has one capacitor and one resistor, I think that's because some of the components are built into the capsule itself. If you're wondering about how that circuit works, he even has an explanation of it. And I linked that and put it in the show notes. The other thing, when I first saw it, I was like, oh, I wonder how they dampen the vibrations. And that's talked about as well. If you look at the image, you can see like a little blue circle inside of the 3D printed rings. And that is a silicone grommet that is part of the like drone racing gimbal mechanism. So it's like some completely different thing, but it works here really well to suspend the microphone elements inside of this protective cage that they're hanging out in.
All right, my next hack is Radio Abuse's regen receiver with few parts. And I don't know, I haven't talked about enough radio geekery on the show. I'm going to make up for that in spades tonight. This one is a regenerative receiver, which is a really clever, very early radio receiver design. The most conspicuous looking part of it is this gigantic inductor that you have to basically wind yourself around like a 4-inch former center. So it's this huge toilet paper roll sized wraps of copper. What the regenerative receiver uses this huge inductor for is to basically make a resonant circuit. And the trick here is that you tune it so that it almost oscillates by itself, but not quite. And that makes it extremely sensitive to radio frequency signals coming in at about the frequency that it wants to oscillate at. So what you do is you set this thing up so that it's just about to squeal horribly, and then you wait for a radio signal to come in and push it over the edge.
Signal gets quite a bit louder.
I'll answer your questions toll free.
And riding this edge between the thing making a horrible racket and then being an incredibly sensitive radio receiver is the secret. And it's also kind of its Achilles heel, because when the radio signal that's coming in changes in signal strength, you kind of have to tweak this regen knob a little bit to keep it tuned in nicely. So this is a really cool old circuit, and this video goes through fooling around with it, but it also goes through a couple great resources for kind of doing your own modern version of this regenerative receiver. And I thought I'd feature those too. One of them is worldradiohistory.com, which has a bunch of old radio magazines online. In the video, Radio Abuse says that he first saw the circuit that he used in the July 1997 issue of Electronics Now magazine. And I'm like, oh, I'll just Google that real quick. And lo and behold, it's online and ready for you to read. And so you can go through electronics magazines of the last century until you need to get back to work. That's good fun. You can't talk about regen receivers without talking about Charles Kitchen, who's done a bunch of work with them in the 2000s. And if you're looking for a matching transmitter to go with this thing, Bill Mira put one in the comments section. He points to actually a Hackaday IO project. Anyway, regen receivers are awesome, sensitive, tweaky, a little bit hard to use. And wonderful. You can make a radio with one transistor and a whole bunch of copper wire.
Yeah, I like how he shows that it is fine the way that it's pictured, which is just kind of like the board sitting flat on the table. But then if you turn it on its side, it gets way better reception. And so he's like, well, I guess I should have tested out how it was going to work best before I mounted the coil on there. For me, though, I went and looked at the circuit and I'm like, that is really cool. I'm like, I should make something like that. And I was like, oh, I wonder if I can make it on a breadboard, which I'm sure there's no possible way, Elliot, that you can make this on a breadboard because this thing is like 90% capacitors.
Right?
There's an LM386 on it. There's like a 3904 transistor and I don't know, 3 or 4 resistors. But then there's no less than 12 different values of capacitors on here. I think there's something like 14 different capacitors in use here. It's wild.
Yeah, and since this is an old radio circuit, the actual tuning is done with a big old air gap variable capacitor, and that part might be hard for you to source these days. And that might be what stops you from doing this unless you have a good collection of variable capacitors.
So do you have to have that? Is there not a modern equivalent for it?
There isn't a good one. You can do it with varactors, which are diodes that are kind of abused for their variable capacitance. But I think they don't have much capacitance to them, and so that would limit the range over which you could tune. I don't know. I picked up a bunch of them at a surplus store here for $4 each. I mean, they're out there if you want to find them. But if you go to a ham fest, of course, you can pick up fancy air gap variable capacitors. You could build one yourself out of some aluminum plates and a rotor, I guess. I don't know.
It's like Indiana Jones and the Radio of Doom. Like everyone's out to get just the right variable capacitor.
Exactly. But it's funny you talked about this guy's reception problems with tipping the inductor on the side. It's worth noting that I'm not sure that Radio Abuse fully understood the circuit he was making, because the part that he didn't put in there was the antenna. And so he was getting fairly decent reception of local radio stations without any antenna attached at all. And he, at the end of it, says, this only works kind of so-so. I think I'm going to take it apart and reuse the parts for something else. I think he didn't give it entirely a full fair shake. What you want to do is put, like, I don't know what, for AM radio, a 4-foot length of wire on the antenna part and see what you get then. Because regen receivers are tweaky, they're horrible, but they can also be infinitely sensitive if you're willing to ride the regeneration potentiometer. And you can easily pull in AM signals from like 1,000 miles away with one of these and a good antenna. So don't forget the antenna.
Bin Sun built a special mouse modification for a friend who has limited use of their fingers, a limited motion, I guess, in their fingers. And so these are like a couple of little bolts or knobs on the top of the mouse that are capacitive touch. And so there is a sensor inside the mouse that connects up to these studs, and that'll let you do left and right click. I think it's a really interesting look at kind of the level playing field that mice have become. Like, you expect there to be a clicky circuit in there. And I think that haptic feedback is really, useful. But why aren't there more capacitive touch things in our everyday life? They always seem to be kind of like a novelty thing. And so, Elliot, looking at this, some of the things I thought of are, have you seen where they have the capacitive touch tracks where it's like zigzags nested together? And so it can tell if you're like moving from left to right or right to left over this pattern?
Yeah, totally. Like the slider pattern
that
they use. Yeah.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see, something added on there like that. And of course, when I started thinking of that made me think of Ben Krasnow's SuperCon talk, where he was depositing copper traces onto like non-flat plastic surfaces. I was like, well, that's perfect right there for the inside of the mouse case, something like that.
Wow.
But the other one I was thinking of is I have a Dell XPS 13 developer edition, which means it comes with Linux on it. And one of the things that's wonky for some reason is the like tap to click. Like, you can click the touchpad. It has a switch underneath it. But I like to use tap to click. The problem is with the Linux install I have, the palm detection while you're typing, it's not very good. And so it'll move your mouse around and click on stuff while you're typing. But I was like, the solution for that is to put one of these knobs like on the edge of the case, so that you have to be like touching the capacitive touch thing in order to turn the touchpad on.
Yeah, that's a good solution.
Yeah, so there's got to be more innovation to go here. And so it's really interesting to see Bin Sun doing this.
Next up from me, Zaphod, impromptu metal detector built from the junk bin. And I said haven't done radio in a while. Here's my second secret radio project of the day, because a metal detector of this old school analog style is basically just a radio emitter and receiver, and then you kind of couple them together and tune them to each other more or less by the presence of metal around the big tuning inductor coil. And that's the kind of metal detector he's making here. There's a write-up here on Hackaday.io, and you should absolutely go through the logs on this one, because he covers basically everything you want to know about metal detectors and about all the different kinds of metal detectors, not just the beat frequency oscillator metal detector that he's making. I think Tom Nardi said it in the comments. It's so refreshing to see an all analog build here when it would be cheaper and probably easier to throw a microcontroller at the problem. This was motivated by the need to find a buried surveyor's pin somewhere on his property. And the question was, could I build a working metal detector from what's in my junk box? And the answer is kind of yes. I mean, he built an awesome metal detector, and that's no problem. And it's definitely made out of junk. Like, instead of buying enameled wire, he pulled the enameled wire out of a busted lamp ballast transformer and then like uses a bucket lid for the coil former. And apparently he had a 555 timer kicking around because he uses that for the generated oscillator. But the horrible spoiler is he didn't find the surveyor's pin. And an awesome possibility that shows up in the comments here is that a lot of the times they just put one pin on a property and the rest of them are all referenced to this one. And he might have actually been looking in the opposite corner of his lot for something that isn't there at all.
Now it's a cliffhanger. Now I want to know, like, there's got to be one. And the thing is, the build of necessity is like the best type of build, right? You're like, well,
oh, for sure.
How am I going to find this thing? So I love that. But yeah, it is, it's become a soap opera and there may be many twists and turns.
If you're into metal detectors, we've got two good links for you. One of them is a graph plotting metal detector. This one uses a microcontroller, takes the easy way out. But it's a lot fancier and gives you kind of a little more insight into what's going on with these kind of pulsed inductive metal detectors. And then my absolute favorite metal detector of all time was an art project. Heavy Metal Detectors is the title of this one. And this is a metal detector that lets you walk around Helsinki. It's got a GPS in it, and it plays different heavy metal music for you when you're in different places. So you can go around detecting metal and get a taste of Helsinki's local heavy metal scene.
Now, this next one is a retro computing hack that really has my number, Elliot. You know, some people like to experience the bad old days when you would like sit at a green screen with like your beige box and like it was your mind and the machine and that's all you had, right? And that's hard. I like to have more tools. I like to have more modern tools, but I appreciate the classic stuff. And so what Adam Podstazinski has done here is taken a 68,000 based educational board from 1981 and brought it back to life using a Raspberry Pi. So it's like a computer mashed up with another computer. Like, I get the irony in that, but the great thing about it is it makes it so that you can connect up your modern peripherals to it. So your computer monitor, your mouse, your keyboard, you could even like SSH into this thing if you didn't want to have a dedicated setup, you know, somewhere in your house for it. But he put the education board inside of a nice piece of acrylic. He connected a proper power supply to it, connected the Raspberry Pi to it, and now you have the original iron, if you want to call this iron, to operate on and to try on, but you have kind of like the tools and conveniences of our modern systems to support you while you do it.
Definitely the way you want to go if you want to use the thing, and if emulation is just not cool enough for you.
It's incredible to think about what this hardware was at the time and like how revolutionary it was. And Adam does a good job of talking about like a lot of different devices that the 68K processor was used in. He talks about this demo board itself, which was sold for $495. This is in 81. So I did some online inflation calculator and that is $1,486.
Yikes.
So it's 1,000 plus 486. I don't know if that's anyway, in $21. The thing has a bajillion chips on it, which is there's some major shift that has gone on, right? Because like having a bajillion chips used to be how it was, and now like the most miraculous devices ever have like 17 chips if you count all like the power regulation and the fingerprint sensor. I'm thinking of cell phones, right? So you have like a system on a chip, and you have some other supporting chips, but it's still like just way less stuff on there. And this board only had 32K of RAM. It ran at 4 megahertz and it had 2 RS-232 serial ports. And I think they ran at those 12 volt levels.
Of course, if it's old RS-232, it's got to.
Yeah, and and it's like card edge connectors to get onto them and that sort of thing.
I'll tell you, my only complaint about this build is that he has the Raspberry Pi, which has got all those GPIOs and fast serial stuff, and he only has, 4 blinking lights on it? This thing needs, it needs its entire memory state broken out into like a WS2812 strip or something and just like blinking frantically as you type into it.
Yeah, who was that? I was interviewing someone who was talking about developing games back in the day, like arcade games, and they were talking about debuggers that they had set up. They had like incandescent lamps on them. Yeah, I think I was doing an interview. I wasn't just reading an article on Hackaday. But yeah, and one of the problems was that sometimes the incandescent lamps would burn out, and you'd be looking at the memory and you wouldn't be seeing the bit set that you thought would be set.
Is it a bug or is my indicator lamp not working? Oh, dude. My first quick hack this week is a marvelous 3D printing demo. 3D printing your own sturdy lens caps by DSLR CNC DIY. That's a great YouTube channel name. Basically, these are 3D printed custom-sized lens caps that you can inlay a label into, so it's easy to tell which lens cap goes with each lens. But the coolest part for me is that he uses like the springy handle part from Bulldog clips as the spring mechanism. These are fully fledged lens caps that you can squeeze together and then they spread back out against the inside of your lens to hold it on sturdily, and it's done by a clever reuse of office supplies. Next up, small footprint Scara laser engraver has massive build area. How To Mechatronics had made a Scara arm before and was wondering what to do with it. The answer is throw a laser on it and have it do laser engraving. This pointed out some of the problems that the robot has, which is that the joints aren't perfectly slop-free and it leans over a little bit as it goes further out. That makes the images that it lasers not entirely square. So it's an interesting problem to solve, and I hope we'll get some more insight into that in the future. Next up, calculate like it's 1989 with this HP 15C emulator. This is a beautiful retro calculator. Al X Garza has a nice HP 15 redo. The HP 15s go for $1 million used on eBay nowadays. And so if you want to get your hands on one, the easiest way to do it is to build your own. Purists would complain about the screen on this one. It's got too many digits. It's got too much resolution. But I'm saying it's 2021. Calculate like it's 1999.
First up on my list, resin 3D prints get a new look with paint injection. Andrew Sink came up with this brilliant idea to use what I would call a goo printer to print out really high quality models that have internal cavities inside of them and places where you can inject paint inside of them. This is really interesting, and I'd like to see people maybe doing multicolor prints with different pathways for the dye or the paint. A Simpsons TV for a golden age, Bubba447 3D printed the iconic Simpsons TV back from an age when the TV had feet and would sit on the corner of your living room, and it had something that we affectionately called bunny ears. This one has a Raspberry Pi and an LCD screen inside of it, and the knobs actually work. It has sound, and it will play any number of classic Simpson episodes in random order. And finally, DIY Wigglegram camera lens sends a message to Big Photo. Joshua Bird came up with this one. I was not totally familiar with what wigglograms are, but it is a single photo taken from multiple different perspectives and then kind of like looped like an animated GIF, so that you kind of see different parts of the photo moving. And in this case, it is 3 lenses taken from disposable cameras, put into a 3D printed jig for an SLR, and it splits the, I guess, film frame, but more likely the digital sensor into 3 parts, and it can capture the image from 1 centimeter apart, kind of aiming at a different part around the subject.
Quick hack.
It's time for articles you can't miss. This long-form content has been written by excellent Hackaday authors, and Elliot has the first pick today.
This week I got Donald Papp's 3D printering. Is hassle-free bed leveling finally here? Question mark. And
the answer is no.
No, the answer is actually probably yes.
Maybe, yeah.
The answer is a qualified, he's happy about it. Basically, he got sent a sample of an Anycubic Viper, which uses a strain gauge in the hot end mount to do automatic bed leveling. It's super important to get the first layer of plastic to stick to the printing bed. And one of the parameters that really matters for that is how hard the nozzle is squishing against the bed. And for that, you want it to be extraordinarily precisely located close to the bottom. And these days, there's a ton of interesting tools that will give the printer feedback and let it know how far the nozzle is from the print bed all the way across. And of course, you can do this in a matrix and kind of map out any warps you've got in your print bed too. And so these kind of Z-height probes have made what used to be kind of a twitchy, dark art maintenance issue into something that's automated by 3D printers nowadays. And the kind of common ones are the BL Touch, which actually has a little physical probe held up by a magnet that goes and touches the board. It has to press the board before the nozzle from the printer does, but then it has to get out of the way. It has to be higher than that nozzle later when you're printing. And so there's all sorts of gimmicks and weird ways to get around this problem. The idea of putting a strain gauge on the hot end itself takes kind of an end run around all of these funny little probe ideas by simply measuring the force when the nozzle hits the print bed. So the printer runs the head down until it hits it, can feel when it hits the print bed, and it knows exactly what the height is at that moment.
Yeah, if you're not already into 3D printing and you don't know a ton about bed leveling, Donald does an excellent job of explaining it. So you should go and check it out. And I think looking at the different types that Elliot just mentioned, like the bigger problem there is that you really want to measure the print head. And so like you want to measure the nozzle, like where the rubber meets the road. And so this is doing that. It's doing it in a way that is arguably more precise than capacitive and more repeatable. And one of the points that I thought was really interesting that Donald mentions is it preheats the head before it measures. Because if, when you heat things up, they expand. And so if you measured it cold, you'd be off. And then the other thing is he recommends you back out the filament and clean the print head because it goes to the same points multiple times in each of its auto bed leveling cycles. And so if you have filament that's just sitting in there, conceivably it could melt. Gravity would pull it down a little bit and you deposit a little bit of plastic there, which would upset your setting that way.
Although I've heard from people who have these kind of sensors that it's not really such a big deal. And I guess if the nozzle's up at temperature already, it's just going to squish this plastic and you probably don't have to worry too much about it. I'm like a Luddite. I actually level my bed myself the old-fashioned way, like slipping a piece of paper under the nozzle until it just barely catches and doing this a couple times. And the truth is, if you do that right and then you don't move the printer, you don't have to re-level the bed very often. But for people who are just new at this is like a hair-pulling issue. And so it's really interesting to see a whole bunch of solutions for it. I think the inductive sensors are a little sloppy, but they're quick and dirty and they can handle it pretty well. The ones that flip in and actually touch the board like the BL Touch are pretty cool too. I'm stoked to see this one work. I wonder if there isn't more cooler things that you could do with a strain gauge on the extruder head. Like sometimes when you're printing, if the print's starting to warp at a corner, it kind of rides up on it and pushes down hard on it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes if you're doing overhangs, it doesn't have any back force. And if you're printing too wide, it'll have too much back force. I bet there's actually a whole bunch of interesting data you could take from a strain gauge on the hot end that would help diagnose other parts of your printing. And I don't think the firmware on this particular printer has gotten anywhere into any of that. And that's something that I'd love to see the hacker community start looking into.
So the BL Touch, is that a capacitive sensor as well? Do you know?
No, it's got a little probe with a plastic stick on the end of it that
Okay.
actually hits a micro switch, and it just moves out of the way with an electromagnet when it's not in use.
Right, because one of the things I was thinking about with this is it lets you use surfaces that are not conductive.
Right.
If you're doing capacitive bed leveling, you need something that is going to work with the capacitive sensor.
And the problem with that is then if you want to print on glass on top of that, you've got a 3mm, 5mm thick piece of glass that doesn't capacitively couple. So, you kind of have to figure out what this offset is, and that kind of undoes one of the newbie-friendly virtue of auto bed leveling, which is you just don't have to mess with it at all, and it just works. I think this stands to be a really interesting solution to the problem. I just want to see it do other tricks rather than just bed leveling.
Our last can't miss article of this week is a wonderful live reporting, which is so rare these days, from our own Jenny List. The article is called Reporting from BornHack 2021, Hacker Camps Making It Through the Pandemic. Jenny, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me on.
So you went off to camp this week, I think the first time since BornHack last year. Tell us about it.
Yeah, it's normally there would have been several camps over the last 18 months or so, but obviously the pandemics mean that big gatherings are verboten because, of course, we'll all catch the plague. And the Danes have had a very measured approach to how they regulate this kind of thing. And they have allowed certain size gatherings to go ahead. And now they're allowing gatherings to go ahead with a strict vaccination or otherwise testing requirement. So, for instance, when I went, I had to show my British vaccination proof. The best thing about a camp, this actually wasn't a camp like, say, one of the very large camps where it's 4 or 5 days. It's a week long. It's in a Danish forest. And yes, it's a hacker camp, but it's always been, for me, BornHack, about the fact that it's a week-long holiday and you get to meet basically a load of people you know or have similar interests with. But it was so more so this time because, of course, none of the people you've seen for a year. I mean, there are people at BornHack last week that I haven't seen for nearly 2 years. And so this was an odd hacker camp because it wasn't the normal sort of frantic running around. There was a lot of just hanging out with people because you haven't done it for so long.
True, yeah, I can imagine that.
That sounds so good.
So what was it like to, like set up camp? Was everyone in tents? Did they have assigned areas, or do you kind of like camp in villages? And like, how many people are we talking here?
I believe it had somewhere over 300 attendees. I think in a normal non-COVID year, it would have something towards 500. I was involved with the badge sweatshop, sort of doing last-minute assembly of badges in 2019. And I seem to remember we did 450 badges then. So it's not quite as big as this one would be normally, but certainly more than last year, which was 150. And it's a very relaxed camp, as most camps are, to be honest. And I think anybody could have camped, just rocked up anywhere and camped where they wanted. But in my case, because I was sort of lone random Brit, I ended up hanging out with a bunch of friends of mine from the Netherlands. And you know, if you look like you're going to be lonely, muck in with somebody else and pretend you've got friends. You know what I mean?
Hey, speaking of the badge, what was that like? I see Thomas Flummer did it again this year.
Yeah, Thomas Flummer is, as you guys know, he's something of a leading light in sort of European badge life designs. He's come out with some beautiful stuff. And of course, this year he's facing the semiconductor shortage, as we all are.
Right.
And so he's got to come up with sort of 300 or 400 badges with some little microcontroller and whatever other whizzy things that he can get sponsored. And of course, there's none of it happening. I mean, imagine that you had to get 400 microcontrollers. I don't think any of us could easily lay their hands on 400 microcontrollers out of the blue without spending significant money. So obviously he couldn't do that. So what he did was he made a very simple badge with no components. And yes, he could have taken the very, very sort of straightforward route of just making a prototyping board. But He figured that most of the attendees, particularly the Danish ones, are going to turn up with one of the previous badges. I mean, he's done the badges for the last several years, and they've all got a little similar microcontroller on board, and they've all got a shitty add-on connector. And so what he made was a shitty add-on prototyping board, and it's kind of cleverly designed. It's got areas for surface mount and through-hole prototyping, but he's designed it so that it can be used just as easily as a shitty add-on host or client. So you could stick it onto a badge, or you could build something onto it that would power a shitty add-on if you wanted. And on the camp, they had a badge hacking area, which had great big sort of boxes of all sorts of discretes and the odd little sort of 555. No microcontrollers, as you might expect, but people had all sorts of little Arduino boards and stuff. And so people were effectively assembling their own blinkies on the fly. I have to admit to my chagrin that I didn't, and I had a good reason for this, actually. One of my little side projects is I'm a curator of a European badge museum for the badge.team project. And so my badge is actually going into the museum, so I wanted it pristine, and that's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. But there were some particularly nice badges people had done. The one that sticks most in my mind is somebody has done a lot of soft robotics work with sort of inflatable silicone bubbles. Sort of looks like a flat silicone tile, and then he sort of flicks a switch and a little compressor works, and it sort of blows up into this sort of vaguely organic looking bubble. It's the uncanny valley of soft robotic effects, because it kind of looks like one of those dreadful pimple popper videos on YouTube, but he fitted one of those to the front of this thing with an LED behind it. He had a little Arduino or similar on the back of it, and he had this little pump in his pocket, and so he's wandering around with this nice lit up badge which occasionally would unnervingly expand. I believe he has a page on hackaday.io, and I think there's a write-up coming up for Hackaday, so you'll see it in due course.
One of the things that caught my eye in this article are your pictures of the nightlife, and I'm seeing crazy lasers and fire. Tell us a little about that.
And they come down to a guy from a bit there in Amersfoort, a guy called Dimitri Moderman. And Dimitri he's like Superman. He's this sort of mild-mannered hacker by day, and by night he goes into the phone box and comes out as this laser-toting display master who basically he makes flamethrowers. I think he uses a fire extinguisher bottle as a reservoir, pressures it up, and then when it lets go with a solenoid, it blasts all this propane past a pilot burner, makes the good whoomph of flame. And he also brought along a whole load of laser effects. The really cool thing about this one was that because it's a small enough camp, he actually had his laptop and he's sitting there on a table in the middle of the field. And so people coming to watch things would crowd around him and watch him do it. And then he was giving people a go, because effectively it's all computer controlled. You can't actually do anything naughty. You can't actually set anything on fire or hurt anybody. And so it was great to see. For instance, there was a young girl, a daughter of one of the Danish hackers, who was there. And I don't know how old she is, probably 10, 11, 12, something like that. And to see her sitting down in front of the laptop and suddenly realizing all these buttons make fire. That was really, really cool. I think quite a lot of people had their chance to play with lasers. At the top of the write-up, there's a big Born Hack logo. That was projected across the field onto the forest. And it actually took me an enormous number of tries to get the right effect for that photograph. What we had was there were some guys with a campfire. It's a scouting terrain, so there's a big fire pit they all sit around, and we were waiting for it to produce enough smoke for it to catch the lasers. And I'm standing up in the middle of the field, slightly unsteadily on top of a table, holding the camera above my head, trying to get just the right shot. So that picture is actually picked from about 100 shots of either partial or imperfect Born Hack logos. But yes, the atmosphere at this camp at night was rather good. It's a small camp. Other camps are friendly, but this was more friendly in that you actually knew the people slightly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we had such a fun time, the three of us hanging out at CCC camp in 2019. And for so many people, that's, like you said, you have friends you haven't seen in 2 years because of this. Like, that's where you see a lot of those people. And so, living vicariously through your trip to Bornhack this year, and obviously last year was a much different experience, but it did go on. I think it's safe to say we're all, just waiting for next year. And hey, who knows? Maybe we can all get together at MCH.
There's certainly nothing like being recharged by being with the rest of your community. The nature of our community is that we're spread across the world, and it's like the revitalization of our community comes from meeting the people from different parts.
That's all the time we have for this episode of the Hackaday podcast. As always, we'd love to hear from you. You can leave a comment in the show notes, which you'll find at hackaday.com/podcast. You can email us, editor@hackaday.com. We live and die by the tips that you send us, so if you've seen something cool or you've done something cool, please tell us about it. tips@hackaday.com. And until next time,
Keep on hacking.
lovely.
What?
I don't know. Doo-ka-doo-ka-doo, doo-ka-doo-ka-doo.
What the regenerative receiver, I think I'm off the rails here.
Digga-digga-dun, dun-dun-dun-dun.